You can be turning to Esther chapter 3. And we're going to read a little bit here. We're going to start don't let that top title scare you. Modern Antisemitism. We'll explain all that. And if I got time at the end, I'll kind of tell you my motivation that started this besides what you would think would be the obvious. But if I've got time, I'm afraid sometimes me as a preacher, Brother Jim, he's a preacher, and I know he's been a preacher a long time, but I can get carried away with some of the preliminaries, so we're going to kind of jump into this. But at the end, I'll try to give you a little bit of maybe some of my motivation behind this besides what you might think would be the obvious here. So let's just go ahead and read this. That way I won't hee-haw around and say it 10 different ways. I want to read this to you. Of course, I don't get these from books. All my sermons, about 98% are me just reading the Bible. I type these up and get some things here and there, but for the most part, this is mostly my heart and me just trying to give you some things I think will help us. But if you're there in Esther 3, the point of the introduction here is to kind of tell you the time period. I always like to tell you kind of when something was written and what was kind of going on. So you've got the Media-Persian empires, the Medes and the Persians. They overtook the Babylonian Empire. The first of that world empire is Nebuchadnezzar, and we know that from Daniel and not just Daniel, but anyway. So you've got the second of the world empires that have taken over the world, and of course that includes the Israelites. But I want you to notice this, though. A small remnant would return, speaking of Jews, to Jerusalem and the homeland by order of Cyrus, who was the Persian king. That was about 535. So about 590 approximately was when Jerusalem kind of officially fell, and most of the people were taken 500 miles east into Babylon. A few people remained in the land just kind of to keep it from being totally overrun. Jeremiah was there a portion of that time. He was kind of the prophet to the people there. Ezekiel, as we would read, will be in 500 miles over there in Babylon. But all that being said, eventually that 7-year captivity kind of ended, and things were starting to transition. What's interesting is God used a Gentile, a non-Jewish king to say, you know what, I'm going to move his heart and not only let the people go back that want to go back, but I'll finance it and I'll protect that work. And God used Cyrus to do that. Unfortunately, most of the people did not return back. The two books of Nehemiah and Ezra describe the rebuilding of the temple as well as the building again of Jerusalem. We don't have a whole lot as far as Bible that tells us what most of the people were doing outside of Ezra and Nehemiah, except for one book, and it's a very unique book. That's the book of Esther. It kind of just gives us a little snapshot and a very unusual event that happens there in the Mede and Persian Empire. So most of the people would not return to be a part of the rebuilding and the repopulating process. The book of Esther contains events of the people who stayed in a previously captive state. They didn't have to stay there. In fact, God's will was, I believe, for them to all go back, but they got used to the surroundings. It's just like when the people left Egypt. They kind of said, yeah, it's good to be free, but, you know, we kind of miss the meals. We miss the structure, if you please. But that's interesting. Now, recent events. We're coming now to our recent events, present day. Connected with modern-day Israel has dramatically increased what is known as, and that's, when I started doing this, you see anti-Semitism. It should just be one anti. I was getting all confused with anti-Semitism. I think, well, anti would be for, but anyway, so that's the only, I think, mistake on my outline. So anti-Semitism, you hear that, and I thought, I know what it is, but where did that come from exactly, that exact word? Well, I'll give you just a little bit of history of that, and that's just enough to help you understand what's going on. The reason why there's been an increase of what we call this anti-Semitism, a dramatic increase, of course, is what happened October 7th, okay? Israel was attacked. You know all the damage that was done. However, the world, because of the way the world is, and I believe, as Brother Jim is saying, the way things are going anyway, the reaction to it, the fighting and every little thing, well, you did it the wrong way, you did it this, you need to stop that, you know all the political stuff about it. But the thing is, instead of people kind of coming to not physically to their aid, but just kind of in our mind saying, wow, those people need to defend themselves. It's totally turned around, and they're the bad guys. They're the bad guys, and it's become, here in America, you'll see it increase much more. It's just this, and I know we're not shocked by it, but when you look at it, that's kind of what really has given up maybe some people the excuse to be this way. And then, of course, in the last week or so, when Israel decided it was going to take out some generals that was kind of the mastermind behind this, I think in that consulate in Syria, that's where Iran says, now you can't do that. And Iran's always been involved anyway. They've always been involved, just like Danny, we've had this discussion. The Vietnam War, you weren't just fighting North Vietnamese soldiers, you were fighting China, you were fighting Russia, and you got people that kind of, we're guiltless, but Iran wants to be the main power force there in the Middle East, and now they're really saying, hey, we're not ashamed to tell you, we're going to destroy you, and that's where we see it. Okay, that's them. But what about the rest of the world that's saying, yeah, get them? Well, it's just a manifestation of things that, in my opinion, people that don't understand how much they hate God and how much they hate God's people, but sometimes that comes manifest, and that's really starting to become the thing today. Now here, just that third paragraph, basic notes of modern day anti-Semitism. By definition, you already know this, it's hostility and hatred toward the Jewish people. Whether or not they're actual citizens of Israel, that doesn't matter. You can be a Jew in America or anywhere in the world, but maybe especially people that are literally Jews in Israel. But it just means there's this great hatred and hostility toward them. The term anti-Semitism was first coined in 1879, interestingly enough, by a German agitator by the name of Wilhelm Marr. So I looked this up. That's where it was first, used as a word. He designated the anti-Jewish campaigns underway in Central Europe during his day. It became turned into what we call Nazi anti-Semitism during Adolf Hitler's regime. And we know that the Holocaust, and some people say it didn't happen, some people say the numbers are greatly exaggerated. I don't think that. I think when our soldiers went in and the world was able to see what they could see, the amount of bodies, all of that, 6 million people. Now imagine taking out 6 million people in the amount of time they did it in, by the way. And Joseph Stalin did some of the same things in Russia too. And some of this stuff kind of goes on, this ethnic cleansing mentality. When I was in Bible college, before I went up to the UP of Michigan, the area in Chicago that I was at, it was not just predominantly one nationality of people. A lot of those neighborhoods were predominantly Latin American, Spanish. Our bus route had almost the world there, but I remember we met people from Croatia and places over there where at the time or maybe just before we got there, there was things going on in that part of the world, and these people were here because they fled that. I don't know if my wife remembers, we had a family come of 11 or 12 on our bus. They knew nothing I was saying, but somehow they figured out I was trying to get them to go to church, and they all came to church. I don't know what Sunday school they ended up. They probably just walked around going, it feels good. I don't know what this is all about, but they knew we were good, and maybe God spoke to them there somehow with, like the book of Acts there. But anyway, so what I'm saying is this term had been used for some time. Then, of course, during World War II, all of that went on. So the origin of the word, if you're wondering, now, where do you get the Jewish aspect from? I kind of had an idea, but I kind of figured out as I found this one site that kind of spelled it out very completely. Between the Latin and the Greek, it's basically trying to give you the name Shem. Now, you know Noah had those 3 sons. Let's see, it's Shem, Ham, and Japheth. And you kind of figured out where they went. Well, Shem is kind of representation of not just the Jewish people, but Arab and Jewish people. But somehow they figured out a way to say, without saying we hate the Jews, they came up with a term called anti-Semitism. And in case somebody doesn't figure that out, it's basically hatred of the Jews. I wanted to say that because we're living in a time when it's really ramped up. We're not shocked. It's always been around. We get that. But the thing is, I don't want to get too far into this because I want to give you something tonight. you're going to think, well, how did we get off the anti-Semitism route? I'm going to show you some things I found studying this I thought was quite unique, that how God operates, and we're going to use Esther to do this. But the big thing for us is, of course, where does America stand here? And so I'll just leave that one for now because I'll get on a rabbit trail here. So look at Esther chapter 3. I think you're already there. Esther 3. And we will show you an example that many of you already know, but I want to give you some things in my study that I didn't realize as I was looking at this I wasn't even looking for. And it just kind of jumped out at me, and it was, I thought, unique, and I think it will be helpful to us. All right, so Esther chapter 3. Chapter 3, notice verse 1. It says, "After these things did King Ahasuerus promote Haman, the son of Hammedatha." Now notice the next word, the Agagite. Most people, including myself, and Brother Green is probably a lot smarter person than I am, and probably a lot smarter preacher, but he, like me, that meant nothing to me. Hammedatha, so what? The Agagite, big deal. All right? Well, I thought that too. All right, so notice that. So here he is. It mentions he's the son of this fella, and that particular fella is an Agagite, which, to be honest with you, I know most of the ites in the Bible, you know, all these different ites, the Hittites, the Jebusites, and so ites. But the Agagite was one that's like, well, wait a minute, that one is one I don't think I've heard very much, and there's a reason for that. So we're going to come back to that. So here's this man by the name of Haman. He's part of the king's cabinet, and advanced him and set his seat above all the princes that were with him. It would be the equivalent, as I have here in my outline, of being the prime minister of the country, if you wanted to kind of figure out what position did he have. Basically that. It says, "And all the king's servants that were in the king's gate bowed and reverenced Haman, for the king had so commanded concerning him. But Mordecai," now again, we can tell you a lot about the story, but you know, most of you know Mordecai and his connection with Esther. "He bowed not, nor did him reverence. Then the king's servants which were in the king's gate said unto Mordecai, Why transgressest thou the king's commandment?" Now, let's just stop here. We're going to come back to this. Now, what helps me understand this particular person, interestingly enough, is I wanted to find out, well, who's this Agagite? What is that? What is the Agagite? All right, so help us understand that. I want you to turn your Bible there to 1 Samuel chapter 15. 1 Samuel chapter 15, so turn back. 1 Samuel 15. I realize this is not preachy tonight, but I think don't be scared of just knowing these facts and these truths. And I think this is pretty exciting to me, to be quite honest with you, because I had no idea. But we're going to give you something I think that'll get you excited, I believe. All right, so we're going back now in time, Samuel. Now, the last two Bible studies, we've talked about David and Saul. So, interestingly enough, we come back to this. Samuel also said unto Saul, "The Lord sent me to anoint thee to be king over his people, over Israel. Now therefore hearken thou to the voice of the words of the Lord. Thus saith the Lord of hosts, I remember that which," notice, Amalek did to Israel, "how he laid wait for him in the way when he came up from Egypt. Now go and smite Amalek," now notice this, "and utterly destroy all that they have, and spare them not." Now this is God speaking. This is hard for some people to accept, but this was God. "But slay both man and woman, infant and suckling, ox and sheep, camel and ass." That's what Saul was supposed to do. And when the Bible says utterly destroy, it means nobody is left, and to be honest with you, nothing alive, all right? You say, okay, I hear that. So what was this thing then? Why was God at this point putting Saul in the position to do this? Well, to help us understand that, go back to Exodus chapter 17, if you will. Exodus 17. Exodus 17, back in Moses' day, all right? Exodus 17. And we're going to start, I guess I've got verse 6 there without giving all the story here. But notice what it says here. "Behold, I will stand before thee there upon the rock in Horeb, and thou shalt smite the rock, and there shall come water out of it, that the people may drink. And Moses did so in the sight of the elders of Israel. And he called the name of the place Massah and Meribah because the chiding of the children of Israel, and because they tempted the Lord, saying, Is the Lord among us or not?" Now notice that. Okay, so they get water out of the rock. Now notice this group that shows up here. "Then came Amalek and fought with Israel in Rephidim." All right? It's almost like they just show up and they begin to fight. All right, notice verse 9. And Moses said unto Joshua, choose us out men and go out, fight with Amalek. Tomorrow I will stand on the top of the hill with the rod of God in my hand. So Joshua did as Moses had said to him and fought with Amalek. And Moses, Aaron, and Hur went up to the top of the hill. And it came to pass when Moses held up his hand that Israel prevailed, and when he let down his hand, Amalek prevailed. I still don't understand all exactly that means, but there it is. If you're winning, I'm doing this, then keep his hands up. If his hands down causes the battle to go against him, then that's interesting, but there it is. But Moses' hands were heavy, and they took a stone and put it under him, and he sat thereon. And Aaron and Hur stayed up his hands, the one on the one side and the other on the other side, and his hands were steady until the going down of the sun. Now notice this is interesting. This helps us understand why was God so upset that he wanted to destroy these people. And Joshua discomfited Amalek and his people with the edge of the sword. And the Lord said unto Moses, write this for a memorial in a book and rehearse it in the ears of Joshua, for I will utterly put out the remembrance of Amalek from under heaven. Now God's saying there's going to come a time when they won't even be remembered. That's what God said. Verse 15, and Moses built an altar and called the name of it Jehovah Nissi. For he said, now here's an altar with God's name built on it. Notice verse 16, for he said, because the Lord hath sworn that the Lord will have war with Amalek from generation to generation. Now that's quite interesting. So from that point until Saul is about 550 years. All right? Go back to 1 Samuel chapter 15, if you will. 1 Samuel 15. I know it's a lot of jumping around, but we're getting to some really good parts now. All right, you said, we got Amalek, I get it, all right. But you said this Haman fellow was the son of an Agagite. Okay, I know. Notice here in verse number 8. And he took Agag, that's the king's name of the Amalekites, all right. And he took Agag, the king of the Amalekites, alive and utterly destroyed all the people with the edge of the sword. But Saul and the people spared Agag and the best of the sheep and of the oxen, of the fatlings and the lambs, and all that was good, and would not utterly destroy them. But everything that was vile and refuse, that they destroyed utterly. Now, we know the story here. Saul disobeyed, and it was one of the big marks against him. You just didn't do right, Saul. And so let's skip down here to verse number 33. So Samuel shows up and confronts him. All right. So what happens here to Agag? All right. Notice here in verse 33. Verse 32. Then said Samuel, bring ye hither to me Agag, the king of the Amalekites. And Agag came unto him delicately. And Agag said, surely the bitterness of death is past. Here's this king kind of walking up. You can imagine when the Bible says delicately, he's like, oh, come on, guys. Everything's cool, right? And this is the way somebody said it. Everything's fine, right? Surely you're not upset with me right now, are you? Notice what old Samuel the prophet says. As thy sword hath made women childless, so shall thy mother be childless among women. And Samuel hewed Agag in pieces before the Lord in Gilgal. So you can imagine, here's the man of God. You're talking about, why does the man of God get kind of excited? I'll tell you what, you imagine, here's Samuel, when everybody's seen Samuel, he's the holy man, of course. He's taking a sword and he is chopping up and making mincemeat. He's making Agag tartar, if you've ever watched cooking shows. He's tore up. Preacher, I wouldn't say it that way. Well, I'm telling you what it says, and the Bible put it there for emphasis. Now, wait a minute. Now, notice what Samuel said here, though. What was Saul supposed to do? Wipe everything out. Now, I know he left some animals alive, but wait a minute. It sounds like he just left one man alive, and it's the king. But that's not what he did. He didn't leave, I don't believe he left just one man, the king, because he's eventually getting ready to die too. So it sounds like if all he did was let the king live and the animals, okay, that's one thing. We're talking about these people, the Amalekites. It sounds like to me when Samuel took care of Agag, that took care of the Amalekites. They're finished, done. Well, that's not what happened. You know why? Because notice what Samuel says here about his own mother. As thy sword hath made women childless, so shall thy mother be childless among women. You can't be childless when if you're dead. That wouldn't make sense to say it that way. In other words, he's saying your mother is not going to have a child anymore because I'm getting ready to execute you, which is what he did. Now, wait a minute. All this time passed, and God says, I'm never going to forget that Amalek came against my people, and I'm going to finish them eventually. I believe that's what Saul was called to do. When Samuel showed up and says, look, now is the time to take care of these people once and for all, and you're the man to do it. And God says, you've got a big job here. And I am sure that this idea of the Amalekites was a big deal because this thing had been handed down. One of these days, God's going to finish these people. And these people were just kind of hanging around. I think Saul, one of his big jobs was, you destroy everything and there should not be any more Amalekites. That's not what he did, though. All right? Now, I'm making that point because how in the world then, in fact, let me share something else with you here real quick. If you'll indulge me here. This is not on your outline. I did this after this. Turn back to Deuteronomy chapter 25, if you will. And I'm going to quit apologizing because this may be a little bit more lengthier than normal. But are you okay so far? Isn't this pretty interesting? All right, so notice Deuteronomy 25 real quick. Going back to Moses. Moses at this point is literally getting ready to go up to the mountain. He's getting ready to his life will end. So Moses is making, through the Holy Spirit, of course, a lot of important announcements here. So notice chapter 25, 17 through 19. Now Moses is, again, getting ready to pass off the scene. Here's what he's telling the people. And certainly Joshua is kind of the main man to hear this, of course. Remember what Amalek did unto thee by the way when ye were come forth out of Egypt. How he met thee by the way and smote. Notice these people what they did. And smote the hindmost of thee. They came up from behind. Even all that were feeble behind thee. So that means the old folks that couldn't keep up, the sickly ones, the people in our generation, the walkers and the canes, the people saying, look, I can't go very fast. Well, these people came up and started killing those people when thou wast faint and weary. So they were already, everybody just faint and weary just because of the conditions. And notice the phrase, and he feared not God. Now, that's not just by accident there, that phrase, and he feared not God. Now, that's important to this anti-Semitism thing, okay? Let me just go ahead and say this now. This is not just about hating a bunch of people. This is people that hate God and hate anybody connected with God. Nationally speaking, physically speaking, as we've talked much about David being literally in the bloodline, Jesus, we know the Father's blood and we understand all of that. Jesus was without error. But still the connection, physically speaking, to David and the Jews. All right, now, so you've got that. Remember that, he says, don't forget that. Go back to 1 Samuel chapter 30, look at verse 1. 1 Samuel 31. Remember our story last week, and I had no clue I was going to do this last week at all. You know the weird position that David was in. Saul's going to kill me, and I'm going to go just kind of line myself up with the Philistines for a while. Then the Philistines said, we're going to go after these Israelites. David says, look, I'm with you guys. It was a weird thing David was doing there. But eventually the Philistine says, you're not coming with us. You know, halfway in the battle, you're liable to turn against us and because you love your people, and you're done. Well, they go back to Ziklag where everybody's kind of hanging out, realize how weird it was. Ziklag is not Israel. But it's just kind of David and the 600 men and their families hanging out. They get back, and they find out the place has been burned. Remember we talked about that last week? And they wanted to stone David because they said, look, we've risked everything for you. We've lost it all. They had no idea if anybody was alive. Guess who those people were that did what they did? Well, look at verse 1. And it came to pass when David and his men were come to Ziklag on the third day, that the Amalekites had invaded the south and Ziklag and smitten Ziklag and burned it with fire. And of course, they take everything. Now, miraculously, nobody's killed and they get everything back. I get that. But guess who this group of people is that God said way back, we're going to destroy these people. Guess who did not do it, and somehow it came upon David. Now, at this point, the very next chapter, Saul is going to die and his sons. But guess who these people are? The very people that God says, I'm going to wipe them from the face of the earth one day, and I'm going to use somebody to do it. a human instrument. Guess who was supposed to have done that? Saul. Guess who did all they did to David and his people? The Amalekites. All right, you say, okay. All right, preacher, I get that. All right, look at 2 Samuel chapter 1. So you're just 2 chapters. Go forward 2 chapters. Saul, of course, he dies. David's interested in what happened. What happened? Of course, I know he's really interested in Jonathan dying. But notice verse number 8. A man shows up from the battle to presumably give David some good news. And he says in verse 8, and he said unto me, who art thou? And I answered him, I am an Amalekite. Now, David, you knew, when he heard that, he thought, I know Amalekites are. You're the people that did what you did to my people. And David heard that. Notice verse number 13. And David said unto the young man that told him, whence art thou? And he answered, I am the son of a stranger, an Amalekite. Supposing the man went ahead and finished Saul off, and David was upset about that. The point I want to make about all of this is, isn't it interesting that the fella that comes to tell David, well, Saul's dead and all this has happened, and thinking that in fact, I've got the crown, and boy, you know, David, you ought to be happy because Saul's dead. He was going to kill you. What's an Amalekite got to do with all of this? He's the one that burnt their city. And why is it an Amalekite of all people? Why wasn't it a Philistine? It wasn't. It was an Amalekite. Very, very interesting here, all right? So you know the Amalekites didn't like God's people. They hated God's people because they hate God anyway. That's what these people are all about. Go back, if you will. Let's see one other place. All right, look at Psalm 83, if you will. Psalm 83, then we're going to go back to Esther. I know I can't give you all this tonight, but the truck is loaded, and I've got to get some of this off. And I won't be able to get it off next week. All right. Psalm 83. Psalm 83. All right. Notice verses 1 through 7 here. Keep not thou silence, O God. Hold not thy peace, and be not still, O God. For lo, thine enemies make a tumult, and they that hate thee have lifted up the head. Now, bear in mind, we're talking about in a day and age in which you think, well, what's these enemies of people got to do with God? I'll tell you what, it's always been the case. The enemies that are getting ready to be listed here, they hate God. They hate God. And assuming this is David, the psalmist, whether it is or not, doesn't matter. Look at verse 3. They have taken crafty counsel against thy people and consulted against thy hidden ones. Now notice the word crafty. As far as I know, and I didn't look this up, but I'm infatuated with especially one time a word being used out of the 785,000 words in the Bible. They have taken crafty counsel against thy people and consulted against thy hidden ones. Notice in verse 4, they have said, come and let us cut them off from being a nation, that the name of Israel may be no more in remembrance. Whoa, who would dare do that? Well, notice verse 5. For they have consulted together with one consent, they are confederate against thee. The tabernacles of Edom, and the Ishmaelites of Moab, and the Hagarenes, Gebal, and Ammon, and Amalek. Oh, the Philistines with inhabitants of Tyre. I'm making a point here because it's interesting that the psalmist here, David or whoever, is saying there's groups of people, and they hate you, God. And, of course, they're going to take it out on us because we're your people. But it's interesting that the language used there in verse 3, they have taken crafty counsel against thy people. And I know you already know this without me having to wait next week to give you this. But who was it who came up with a very crafty plan to not only go against Mordecai, who would not reverence Haman, but somebody said, guess what his nationality is? What? I could see him saying. He's a Jew. A Jew, huh? I'll tell you what, and I'm kind of advancing here very quickly. I'll tell you what we'll do. We'll just destroy all those people is what we'll do. I'm mad at one man, but I'll tell you what'll really make me happy is we'll just kill all of them. All right, go back to Esther chapter 3, if you will. Esther 3, all right. See, I don't think what the Bible, and I know this is the case, but I know things in the Bible, it's interesting to me that as I study these things, there's no accidents, the verbiage and the words that God uses. All right, so we're getting ready to finish this up tonight because I will not finish what I want to, but this will be enough here. But again, go back to the Agagite. You say, preacher, so far I've not seen any Agagite other than what we just read in verse number 1. Except when you take the ITE off, guess what you have left? You have Agag. In my study this, the reason why that's an Agagite is because these was part of the royal family of Agag. Guess who escaped on that day when Saul decided, I'm not going to kill everybody? Now, we know the king eventually got it. That's Agag. But guess who made it through? I believe his mama made it, and I believe a lot of those people escaped because Saul said, you know, we're not going to kill you. And if he wasn't going to kill the king, he probably let a bunch of people go because he wanted all that sheep, and he thought, well, you know what, I've done enough. Here's what makes this story bad. What makes it bad is because Saul was a man that did not do completely what God said. You know what God completely wanted? Utter destruction of those people. And guess who slips through the cracks, if you please, because Saul says, I'm going to do it my way? These Agagites. Isn't it interesting that after all this time, 550 years later, a man shows up in the king's cabinet of all people who happens to be an Agagite, who's a descendant of these Amalekites, and not just a descendant, but a person who has I think a direct connection to old King Agag. Because as you look at this and study this, and I'm sure this probably would be fascinating if I started thinking, wait a minute, this Agagite, I've never heard that before, me either. When I got to looking, though, and I got to figuring this thing out and starting putting things together, this is some descendants of that royal family, and somehow old Haman ends up, and guess who's the guy who's going to come up with a plan to kill all the Jews? Talking about anti-Semitism. Haman. Guess who he happens to be directly, and I don't believe just because everybody was, you know, in other words, I know we're related to people, and I get it, but it is interesting in the Bible that those who come, the Edomites, and you get around these people and they all get on the same, it's almost like they just carry these same bad conditions. Now, anybody could come out of that. Just like if you're in a family, being in a family that's being godless and all of that, you don't have to continue that. You know that. But I know this. Haman, as wicked as he was, it's interesting to me that if Saul had killed everybody he was supposed to have, guess what? There would have been no Haman. There would have been no Haman. Now, my whole point of this is, and if the very last paragraph there on your outline there, we should never underestimate our decisions, any decision. I believe that when Saul thought he was doing pretty good, he was doing horrible, because I believe that obviously God's providence, I know that. But it just goes to show you, here's a man by the name of Haman, and by the way, it almost happened. I know there's a God, but it almost happened that every Jew in the world was going to be destroyed. It was a real big deal, a real big deal. 127 provinces. And we know Esther and the whole story, I get that. So I guess what I'm trying to say tonight is, and we'll say more about the anti-Semitism as we, in the modern sense, but I just wanted to show you that isn't it interesting that how the devil can use bad decisions himself to try to kill God's people or influence of any kind. There is no little decisions, and I believe that when Saul decided not to wipe out every last living thing, that was much bigger. And I believe God was saying, you know what, Saul? I've raised you to go ahead and put the period on the Amalekites. This Agagite happened to be somebody that survived. Look, I believe they killed a lot of people. But you know what? There's no such thing as, well, I did pretty good, God. I did mostly what you said. No, he did not do everything God said. And I believe some of that royal family, they moved on, and somehow they ended up in the cabinet. You can imagine the conversations. Who are you, sir? My name is Haman. Let me tell you my background. Let me give you my resume. Well, I come from royalty myself. Oh, is that right? Yes, sir. I'm an Agagite. What does that mean? Well, there was this king one day, and I bet the Amalekites, because they had enough tenure in the world, if you please, that I'm sure old King Ahasuerus would have said, yeah, I'm familiar with these groups. Well, I'd like to work for you. Well, you definitely got the credentials. You're royalty. Yes, sir. Well, Haman thought he was somebody. Matter of fact, Mordecai says, I'm not going to bow to you. Isn't it interesting that the Jew says, I'm not bowing to you? No, Haman says, you'll bow or else. Hey, he's a Jew. Isn't it amazing how the story ends up, of course, with Esther being the Jew? So you know all that. But I just wanted you to see that there's an example, of course, of the hatred for God's people. But don't forget what it said in Psalm, and don't forget what I believe it was said, that these people were so hateful and so mean, if you please, so evil. Why? Because they hate God.